I noticed you have actually done several picture book biographies. Why did you decide to do one on Pura Belpré?
Well, there's several different reasons that all came together. The first, I was talking to an elementary school librarian, and I always like to ask, what books do you need? And she told me that she desperately needed books that were about people who were Hispanic, that she just had a lot of students who wanted those books and they weren't there. And then my family lived abroad for several years, and not in a Spanish-speaking country. We were in Bosnia, but our children went to public schools there. And we had a kindergartner who did not do well with the transition to another language. And she was very, very sad until the librarian at that school intervened and asked me to come in just once a week to do English language story times. And it made a huge difference in her experience that she had. And when I started reading about Pura Belpré, I realized that she was one of the pioneers of that idea that that stories could be told in the mother tongue of children, and that they should be. And I started to see the really vast impact that she had on librarianship. And I didn't think that that story had been told well enough. And so I wanted to be part of that.
Now, had you known very much about this before you started? Because I was saying, I had heard the name, but I really didn't know who the award had been named for or what she had done.
No, I did not know that either until I started researching her. And then I realized that there were these resonances with my life, that I feel like she's one of those people whose actions changed the world in ways that still affect us, but that we may not be aware of. And so I thought a book was needed.
Yes, definitely. I mean, her life is so fascinating. Like you said, she was a pioneer of bilingual story times, and really just the idea of having these stories in the library, because I know she kind of broke the rules. They weren't supposed to be telling anything that wasn't in a book, and she didn't see the stories that she wanted in a book, kind of like you have done. You didn't see the book with the story you wanted, and so you made it. And she actually ended up writing them down, right?
She did. She published many books. Her first one was Perez y Martina, and the characters from that are in the illustrations that Magaly did. Yeah.
Yes, I love how she worked those into the illustrations. It was just so well done. And like you said, having those kinds of stories and having stories told in Spanish, it really did a lot to attract people to the library, because that was something else that she did, right? And that she actually went out into the community and said, here, Cuentos, like that great illustration, calling people to the library. I'll see, let me see if I can pull that up. But
yeah, so I'm actually on my county's library board, and yeah, I love that illustration so much. And it feels like those Pura Belpré's concerns, that the library reflects the community and that the community feel welcome in the library, are exactly the issues that we deal with on our library board. And I think she brought them to the forefront. Can I tell you a story about that spread you just showed us?
Yes.
Yeah, so I dove deep into the archives to try to make sure that everything in this book was perfectly exact. And I had a very difficult time finding how Pura Belpré originally let people in the community know that she was going to be doing these story times in Spanish. And so I came up with some ideas that, like, maybe there were placards or signs, but I couldn't be certain that any of my ideas were exactly how she had done it, although other people had done. And so my editor and I went back and forth about how we should set up that page. And finally, it was Magaly who solved the problem for us, because she came up with this really witty way of showing that we don't know exactly what Pura Belpré did, but she has this really witty and funny illustration that gets the point across that she let people know that stories were going to be happening. Yeah, and I love
especially that she was doing it in Spanish, that she said Cuentos, and like that just captured the whole concept, right?
Yeah, and that was Magaly's idea. It wasn't like an idea that I gave her. I was totally worried about that part, and then she just elegantly and
Mm.
beautifully solved it, which is a wonderful thing about picture book biographies, that there's that kind of tension between text and illustration that can convey much better than just text alone what the truth is.
So what is the process of collaboration? What was the process between the two of you? Did you write the book and just send it off to her? Was there back and forth? How did that go?
Yeah, usually I write a manuscript and I send it off, and then sometime later the art comes back to me. This was unusual in that our editor suggested that we work more closely together because Magaly is in Mexico and didn't have access to the primary source material that I'd been able to explore. And so when she had questions about like what the visuals should, like what the historical visuals were like, then she would email me and I would try to find her reference photos. So I can take no credit for how the illustrations ended up, but it was fun to be able to converse with her throughout the process via email. So,
Yeah, that must have been a really a fun way of being able to be in touch with something that you're both working so closely on. And why do you think it was so important to tell not just her story, but in general, why is it so important? Like she recognized, and I think we're finally catching up to her. I think it's taken us a long time, and we're catching up to her on the idea of having these diverse stories for all children, but especially children that come from a particular background or heritage, having stories that reflect their background. Why do you think that's so important, and why was that important for you?
yeah, well, for one thing, they're really good stories, and they're wonderful stories that deserve to be told. But also, I think that we misunderstand the world if we think that only one kind of person, that only white males created the good things in our world today. I think that that has really far-reaching implications once we realize that many people from many different kinds of people helped create the things that we love. And so I think it has great value in and of itself.
Yes, I completely agree. What do you think we can learn from her example about this, about how she went about it?
I think that sometimes it takes courage to try something different. And so I think that's one lesson. And then the other lesson, which I'm very moved by in her life, is that stories, even if they're different from most of the stories we hear, our own stories are worthwhile and that they matter and that the world needs to hear them, that the telling of our stories really does matter. And that's what I really hope that children take away from our book, that their story, even if it's different from the other stories they're being given, that their story truly matters.
Oh, that's wonderful. What is next for you?
So I have another book coming out with Abrams in April, and it's my first one that's not a picture book biography. It's a concept book about the idea that people all around the world use the materials that are around them to make music. So it's kind of an encyclopedic look at musical instruments through time and around the world.
Oh, that sounds really fun. I'm trying to think if I've heard of a book like that before. Um, and just to wrap it, I'm sorry, I'm sorry that Magaly is not able to be on it. So this is a little shorter than I planned because I planned some of these questions for her and also to be doing translating. But that's okay. Then we can fill in with more things. So how did you feel? So I'm guessing your background is not Latino.
That's true.
Correct?
Yes, that's
So
right.
how was that tricky for you to figure out how can I tell this story being from a different culture or, even just not being Puerto Rican? Was that tricky for you to figure out how to tell this story respectfully, or was it just something that happened very naturally because her voice came through so strongly to you? Or
Yeah, so when I started the story, I don't think I was as aware of the issues. It's been many years in the making. It sold about 6 years ago.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But in the process of writing it, just doing the research, I came to recognize that I needed to be very careful that I was very deep in primary sources, especially because I didn't have the added lived experience.
Mm.
And so that it was really important to me to make sure that I spend a lot of time in Pura Belpré's writing. I also read a lot of secondary things written by scholars that have written about her. I had a wonderful experience going to Hunter College and looking at all of the resources they have. They hold the Pura Belpré papers, and that includes things that are not papers, like the puppets that she made with
Really?
children. Yeah, yeah, and she helped them. She taught them how to make marionettes and how to make costumes for the puppets. And there's a little bit of graffiti on one of them that taught it was a boys club that did it, and one of the boys had written how much he loved Pura Belpré on the marionette. But yeah, and so I am hopeful that by digging deep into the archives, I was able to at least partially overcome that. Yeah.
Yes, I think you actually, I mean, I remember you talked about the marionettes in here. Let me see if I can find the illustration of it that here you have her working with children. So it wasn't just story times in the way we think of them, but like you said, she had a boys club and she worked. And especially I love that it was a boys club, because we still tend to think of crafts as being something for girls. So I love that. And here, if I can get in closer, there they are working on making the marionettes.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the time, the library had several little clubs for girls. And she felt really strongly that there wasn't anything that was reaching out to the boys. And so she started that club, and then they put on puppet shows together. So she was a real innovator in making sure there was a space for boys in the children's room as well.
That's wonderful. She's such a visionary, I think, in so many of the things that she did. And I'm sorry, what was I going to ask you? So were there a lot of sources? You said you went deep into the primary sources. You mentioned the collection of secondary sources. Was that hard to find, or did you feel like there was a lot of material, you just had to dig into it?
So there's a very wonderful adult book that it's on my shelf. Let's see. I just moved my office, so I can't see where it is. But
That's right.
I'm going to get the title not exactly right. Stories she read to the children, but it's a compilation of her writing. And so that was where I started. And then once I went to the archives, then that's where that book came from. And one of the wonderful things of being in the archives is that I got not only the typescripts of what she'd written, but also her handwritten versions where I could see like how she did the process. And I shared with Magaly one of the copies that the archive let me make of that. And she was inspired to use that in the book. Go to the second to last page. Then she tried to replicate her actual handwriting on these pages here where she's writing. And so that was a wonderful use of the power of illustration.
And such details. I think, the more you know about the story, the more you realize how much she's incorporated in the illustrations. There's just all that detail work.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. But, well, thank you so much for being with us. I think we're actually close to the end of the time. It is wonderful to talk to you and to hear how this book came. I'm going to hold it up one more time. This is Pura's Cuentos. This is how Pura Belpré reshaped libraries with her stories. I highly recommend it to everyone. I've read it with my kids and reviewed it. It's a really beautiful book. And like you said, this is a story that needs to be told, and we need to be telling our children more of these stories. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the hashtag Read Your World. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Take care.